Pakistan is an ally, a difficult ally from Washington's perspective, but it is an ally. And this is something that we've seen over many years, and it's something that America's allies and partners don't like, that the U.S. spies on its friends, quite frankly.
So our former Foreign Minister, Hina Rabbani Khar, she published an internal memo, which was titled as Pakistan's defense. And she feels that Pakistan has been suffering, and Pakistan has rather been sacrificing the realization of complete benefits that
revelation is about what Khar had written will, I think, prompt Washington to redouble the efforts that it's already pursuing with Pakistan. At the dynamics of the U.S. China-Pakistan triangle at this point, I would argue that it doesn't make sense from an immediate term perspective for Pakistan to actually implement that recommendation that Khar. I think here, my sense is that Islamabad is very keen to emphasize its neutrality vis-a-vis the Russia-Ukraine crisis and the war in Ukraine.
And Pakistan does not want to jeopardize its relationship and the possibility of better economic relationships with Russia at a time when Pakistan is suffering a balance of payment crisis.
The U.S. is so far behind China when it comes to investments, infrastructure investments, not just in Pakistan, but in so many parts of Asia.
It was doing a lot for China. It wasn't really doing a lot for the local community, to say so. Even if we look at the predominant 90% fishing community in Gawada, they didn't stand to benefit from it.
It does not pursue this relationship with Pakistan. It does not provide aid to Pakistan out of the goodness of its own heart. But because of cold hard interest. That's very clear and has been.
Hello, everyone. My name is Norez Rana, and I'm an economist with the World Bank. I'll be hosting today's program on New Wave, in which we'll be discussing the Discord leaks, which kind of weigh into how classified documents have been leaked online and the implications that they have for Pakistan. We'll be talking about Pakistan's strategic positioning between China, the US, and Russia. And how has Pakistan been caught up in this conundrum? What are the economic vulnerabilities which face Pakistan, and how to best navigate through them? And to discuss this topic and these issues, we have a very prominent, a special guest with us. I would like to welcome Michael Kugelman, who is the director of South Asia Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center, which is one of the leading think tanks based in Washington, D.C. And I'm sure Michael would have tons to share on the topic. He's very well versed, and he's a subject matter expert on the topic. So thank you for joining us, Michael. We look forward to having this discussion.
Well, thanks for having me, and I appreciate the very kind introduction as well.
And of course, I mean, it goes without saying that you've been doing tons of work and you're very knowledgeable on the area. So without further ado, I'll just dive right into it. I think it's safe to assume that the global power dynamics are slightly shifting. The US hegemony, the US as an unchallenged superpower, is no longer the landscape that exists. China is very rapidly trying to dismantle the US as the economic powerhouse in the world. They're very much up there already. Russia, on the other hand, may not be as powerful, as robust economically, but they've been trying to strong arm themselves onto the center stage. The events of the Ukraine-Russia war, their influence on the global energy markets, these are all they lend credence to this fact and the very prominent evolving landscape that the world is no longer the way it used to be a couple of years ago, a couple of decades ago. So in this current evolving scenario, the Discord leaks happen, and they shed light on the various power calculations of some prominent key countries, including India, including Pakistan, including Egypt, Russia, so on and so forth, about how they should reevaluate, re-strategize their alliances, their global alliances within this changing sphere. And there are very key insights that have surfaced as a result. And I'm talking specifically about those relevant to Pakistan. So our former Foreign Minister, Hina Rabbani Khar, she published an internal memo, which was titled as Pakistan's difficult choices. And there's no doubt that Pakistan has been in a difficult choice due to various policy issues, but what it particularly focuses on in the fact is that Pakistan needs to pivot away from a more West appeasing policy and should align more strategically with China. And she feels that Pakistan has been suffering, and Pakistan has rather been sacrificing the realization of complete benefits that it could have accrued had it not been very, let's say, focused and pro-US. How do you see this? What are the implications of these leaks, of this information coming to the surface for Pakistan? Do you think US would respond to it? I mean, of course, not publicly, but in the way they view their relationship with Pakistan.
Yes, I certainly, speaking for myself, and I'm sure others that focus on Pakistan, were wondering, once the Discord leaks were made, what would be in there about Pakistan, if anything. And it took a few days, and now, indeed, as you know, we know that there is this memo by Hina Rabbani Khar, and yes, it's very striking in the sense that if you look at the public messaging of Pakistani officials over the last year since the current government came to power, the emphasis has actually been on the very opposite of what Carr was arguing for. Islamabad has been calling for good relations with the United States, and there's this emphasis on this idea that U.S. China competition need not impact U.S. Pakistan relations. And in fact, a point along those lines was made just last week when the Pakistani ambassador to the U.S. spoke at the Wilson Center, and he essentially said we shouldn't allow. There's no reason to think that U.S.-China competition should impact U.S.-Pakistan relations. And so, the question is, what's going on here? Why? And we don't know, of course. There's a lot of context that we don't know. We don't know why she wrote this document, who the target audience was. I did note on Twitter that it was apparently written in March of this year. That we do know. And what happened in March? Well, that's when when the White House Democracy Summit took place at the end of March. And of course, Pakistan had been invited to that, and Pakistan declined the invitation, most likely because it knew that China wasn't invited and Taiwan was invited, and that there was reason to think that it was just the latest step of this this geopolitical play by the U.S. to try to rally other countries to its side to push back against China. But it could be that Carr drafted this memo to justify the decision, to try to argue for Pakistan not to attend. Anyway, so there's that. But look, if you look at the dynamics of the U.S.-China-Pakistan triangle at this point, I would argue that it doesn't make sense from an immediate term perspective for Pakistan to actually implement that recommendation that Carr laid out, because America is Pakistan's top export destination. America has a lot of influence over the major international financial institutions that are so important for Pakistan now, like the IMF. And quite frankly, the Pakistani military has very deep person-to-person level connections and relationships with counterparts in the U.S. militaries. For so many years, Pakistani military officials have done training programs in the United States. Their family members go to school in the United States, and so on and so forth. So all that suggested in the here and now, it wouldn't make sense for Pakistan to essentially move on from the relationship with the U.S. and cast its lot with China. But I do think that over the longer term, if you look at the likely trajectory of U.S. relations with Pakistan and Pakistan's relations with China, it does make a lot of sense over the longer term. There's just not much of a sense that you're going to have a deep, expansive U.S.-Pakistan partnership in the years to come, whereas with Pakistan and China, despite some bumps in the relationship in recent months, it's very clear that Pakistan and China have a very there's a very happy future, so to speak, just because of the India factor, that both countries view India as a shared rival, and that lends itself to these strategic convergences. But to be sure, the fact that this was leaked, it sort of raises the question, this broader question that clearly the U.S. was able to access that internal memo. How did that happen? That gets to broader questions about how the U.S. government tends to not only spy on enemies and rivals, but also allies and partners. And Pakistan is an ally, a difficult ally from Washington's perspective, but it is an ally. And this is something that we've seen over many years, and it's something that America's allies and partners don't like, that the U.S. spies on its friends, quite frankly.
Well, there's a lot to unpack here. You've kind of mentioned, and you've very important pertinent points. You talked about Pakistan's relationship with the US in terms the trade relationship more specifically. US is still the biggest exporter of Pakistan. They exported up to, I think, I have these numbers in front of me, up to like $21 billion of goods, which is accumulates to more than like almost double figures in percentage. Overall, there's a net positive trade relationship that Pakistan has with the US. On the other hand, with China, that is really not the cause. Actually, over the years since CPEC happened, the trade deficit has quadrupled between Pakistan and China, and obviously Pakistan being on the harsher side. I mean, obviously importing more than they're exporting to the country. And there was another thing which Hina Rabbani Khar mentioned in a memo, was the fact that Pakistan needs to kind of move away from appeasing the West. And by the West, I'm sure she does not really mean the US. It also encompasses Western developed nations such as the European, those that make part of the European Union. And it's very important to highlight, while we're mentioning the fact that Pakistan has good trade relationships with the US, the EU has accorded Pakistan the GSP, which is a huge plus, which is a huge positive. The UA itself, cumulatively, I think they form up to 27% of exports that go from Pakistan to the European Union. So rightly mentioning in immediate terms and in economic sense, more likely, it makes no sense. But then I think we need to really factor and bring Russia in the picture as well, because there was another part of the leaks which divulged into how there was this conversation between the current Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif with an assistant or a subordinate of him, in which he was recommended that Pakistan should abstain from voting against Russia in the UN Convention. And the reason is that Pakistan for a while has been trying to get and buy crude oil from Russia like India is doing. And Pakistan does not want to jeopardize its relationship and the possibility of better economic relationships with Russia at a time when Pakistan is suffering a balance of payment crisis. There's a lot of external debt, the commodity prices, the oil prices are increasing, and so is the value of the foreign currency. The US dollar is at its all-time high in Pakistan. So I think it's not just about China, US anymore. It could also be possibly that there's a shift towards the Eastern Bloc, which encompasses Russia and China as well. So how do you, bringing in Russia into the picture, how do you see that? Does that add any rationality? Does that make any sense of what Hina Rabbani Khar and Shehbaz Sharif may be pivoting towards?
Yeah, no, the Russia factor is very significant. And to be quite frank, the two bits that were leaked that relate to Pakistan, the Hina Rabbani Khar memo and then the Shehbaz Sharif element, the latter didn't really surprise me. I don't think it's surprising at all that Pakistan would be having deliberations about the need to be careful and choosing to abstain on a resolution condemning Russia. And for the reason that you mentioned, that I think it's important for Pakistan to hedge its bets. And there's been so much ink spilled about India and the position it's taken, where it's been abstaining and it's been taking a muted position toward the Russian invasion of Ukraine because of that special relationship. But you look at Pakistan, and not only Pakistan, but broader South Asia. This is a region where Russia does not have any enemies. It has quite a few friends. Even you look at Bangladesh, where Russia has been investing in the nuclear power sector. 4 of the 8 SAARC countries have abstained from resolutions condemning the Russian invasion: India, Pakistan, as well as Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. Now, in terms of Pakistan, I think here, my sense is that Islamabad is very keen to emphasize its neutrality vis-a-vis the Russia-Ukraine crisis and the war in Ukraine. And given all of these reports indicating that Pakistan has been sending some small arms to Ukraine, that means that it's very important for Pakistan to also go in the other direction and show its support for Russia in various ways. And so that is why I think that one of the reasons why we're now hearing that Pakistan has placed initial orders to import Russian oil. Obviously, that's a move that Pakistan feels compelled to make because of immediate energy security considerations as well. And also, just to talk about the current news this week, the SCO, a lot of discussion about why the Pakistani foreign minister went to India to participate in that summit. Well, one could argue that, of course, the Russian foreign minister is there, and I think it might be important from Islamabad's perspective to show the Russians that it's keen to engage with Moscow. And so naturally, there's already been a brief meeting between Bhutto Zardari and Foreign Minister Lavrov. So all this goes to show that absolutely, I think it makes perfect sense from Islamabad's perspective that it would not want to jump to sign on to these US-sponsored resolutions in the UN that condemn the Russian invasion. Pakistan has to be very careful. It does not want to antagonize Russia for for economic reasons, and also because if we assume it's true that it's sending arms to Ukraine, and there have been so many reports about that, that suggests to me that it is true. It's important for Pakistan to sort of spin around the other direction too, and be sure to make certain gestures to Russia to indicate that it is, taking a neutral position. And Pakistan, of course, is not the only country that's using this calculus. You have other countries in South Asia and countries elsewhere in the world that are trying to hedge and not want to go too far in condemning Russia. And this is one reason why Washington has really struggled to build this broad global coalition ready to take a stronger position against Russia.
Well, thank you. I wanted to pivot the discussion more towards Pakistan-China relationship, and like you said, in the longer term, it does make sense for Pakistan to pivot that way. But before I go there, just to follow up on what you just said, I think in principle, every country should have an autonomous foreign policy. It should not be dictated or strong-armed by, principally any country in the world, whether it's a superpower or not. But in reality is a bit different than how we want, ideally, the world to function. India is better positioned because India is now, all set to be the biggest exporter of refined oil that it bought from Russia. But it does not really find itself in that conundrum. There's no, at the surface at least, there's no challenges, there's no threat to its trading relationships with even other countries, even the US, for instance. However, Pakistan finds itself in a bit more vulnerable position because while we need Russian crude oil to satisfy our energy needs, we need China's help. China just rolled over a $500 million debt that was due. But we also need institutions like the IMF. We also need countries like the US. And it has, at the end of the day, it is because there's very limited policy actions that you can employ, given the fact that domestically, inherently, you're kind of economically weak, and that is a very unfortunate scenario. But anyhow, moving on, I wanted to really kind of gauge your thoughts on the word strategic capital, which Hina Rabbani Khar said that Pakistan should not sacrifice, and she meant that our relationship with China. And historically, even the current perception is that China has been a phenomenal ally of Pakistan. They've been a friend. They've been touted, labeled as friends, and that has been the perceived nature of our relationship. And that was renewed, that was strengthened when CPEC, took the center stage, to say so. But what is not often talked about is the fact that CPEC was not an initiative that China embarked upon to help Pakistan. It was an extension of the Belt Road, the BRI initiative. And they had a lot to benefit from it. Just, the basic fact that their intuition, their idea was to make a corridor that linked Kashgar with Gwadar. And that just by itself would cut 13,000 kilometers of distance via sea route to 2,000 kilometers. What it took for them to trade, supply, and actually even demand, transport goods from the Persian Gulf, from the Middle East, it would take them usually 45 days, and that was cutting off to 10 days. So they had a huge economic incentive, to say so. Pakistan, it was labeled as a game changer, but in retrospect, now that we see, it really didn't change much. Actually, the $62 billion of investment that came in, almost 90% of which was meant to be through a loan instrument, has been a huge contributor to Pakistan's current external debt crisis. And it's not just about those bigger numbers. We can say that CPEC failed, whatever the flaws were. But I wanted to zoom into the granularity, a few more details, the conditionalities of CPEC, and which, when I was reading up on them, it really kind of blew my mind. For example, the tax exemptions that were offered to the China Overseas Port Holding Company was as long as 23 years. They had the Gwadar port was leased to them for 43 years. They were exempted for 20 years. They were given 40-year tax holiday on the import of equipment, materials. The construction of the port and SEZ was handed over to Chinese companies. So it was doing a lot for China. it wasn't really doing a lot for the local community to say so. Even if we look at the predominant 90% fishing community in Gawada, they didn't stand to benefit from it. And the entire conditions, barely any of it is public at the moment, but whatever stats and numbers you look at, they were skewed highly and disproportionately in favor of China and Chinese companies, the financiers, the terms of agreement, the terms of interest. So, and people are viewing China as someone who tends to entrap various countries in their debt trap. We have the example of the Habantota port in Sri Lanka, and now China has ownership for the next 99 years. So what kind of long-term strategic partnership are we looking for? Pakistan hasn't, in truest sense, hasn't really benefited economically from China's investment coming in. And it has got a lot to do with the nature of those investment and the conditions that were levied when Pakistan borrowed those money.
Right. Yeah. So I think one can argue that the China-Pakistan relationship has been, to a considerable degree, a transactional one, in the sense that so much of it comes down to the assistance that China has brought into Pakistan, the infrastructure assistance, the arms supplies, military aid, that type of thing. And I do think that it is inherently, to a degree, a strategic partnership, in the sense that both countries are keen to work together to counter what they both view as their core strategic concern, strategic challenge, that being India. But it is it's an interesting and somewhat of an odd relationship, in the sense that I think there's pressure in Pakistan and Islamabad to overstate just how special the relationship is. I mean, every time you have a senior Pakistani official describing the relationship publicly, it's like hyperbole, like higher than the Himalayas, sweeter than honey. It's almost like cartoonish rhetoric to describe a relationship. But I think that Pakistan feels a lot of pressure to show just how committed it is to that relationship. And indeed, you're absolutely right that it is not, China does not pursue this relationship with Pakistan. It does not provide aid to Pakistan out of the goodness of its own heart, but because of cold, hard interest. That's very clear and has been for quite some time. And China does turn Pakistan down as well. I mean, Beijing tends to be the place that Pakistani leaders have gone the most frequently when badly in need of bailout assistance and so on. But we know that this time around, over the last few months, China has not been willing to step in and provide as much support as Pakistan may have liked. But that goes back some years. I mean, there have been times when Pakistani senior official will go to Beijing looking for assistance and comes home empty-handed. That happened when President Zardari was in power, and he had some failures in that regard. But look, if you just look at the broader geopolitical state of play, if you look at how the U.S.-India relationship is growing so much, if you look at the nature of U.S.-China competition, I think that all the arrows point to the inevitability of a continued deep China-Pakistan partnership. And from Beijing's perspective, just look at the geography, right? I mean, Pakistan, of course, is a country that serves as a gateway to the Middle East, to the Arabian Sea, and of course the port in Gwadar. As difficult as it's been to develop at that port, it's a very strategic warm water port, and this is also important for China's ambitions to facilitate access to key trade routes and so on. So China is not going to want to give up on Pakistan or downgrade its relations with Pakistan, even though there's been some significant concern in Beijing about security threats to its assets and its nationals in Pakistan, as well as concerns about Pakistan's economic mess. China is not going to jettison the relationship with Pakistan. And of course, Pakistan itself, it has never needed China more. But short answer to your question of what should a relationship with China and Pakistan look like on a strategic level, well, I'm not sure. I think that we can look at it as strategic simply because of the shared goal of wanting to push back against India. But I do think the major manifestations of the relationship will continue to be transactional in nature, focused on economic cooperation, economic support, arms support, and so on and so forth. I mean, yes, what is a strategic partnership meant to look like? Now, I could speak from a U.S. perspective. I think the idea is a relationship that has a lot of trust, a lot of goodwill, a lot of defense cooperation, and a lot of broader-based collaborations that go beyond defense. And I think all of that is in place with the China-Pakistan relationship, even with China's concerns about the security situation in Pakistan and perception that Pakistan is not doing enough to provide better security for Chinese investments and all. Despite that, yeah, I think it's a pretty healthy relationship. There's a lot of trust, a lot of goodwill, a lot of cooperation on security levels, and there's a lot of cooperation beyond that as well. Even though it's striking that culturally, Pakistan and China are two very different places, but they still have been able to maintain significant levels of trust, and I think that's going to continue.
Well, that's actually quite, I would say, heartening to know and realize that there's nothing to lose over there, and there's room for improvement between Pakistan and China's relationship, and probably the revival of similar projects with on the lines and the similarity to the ones we already have, the sub areas of the CPEC. But I guess Pakistan first needs to really get its own house in order as well. Make sure that the enabling environment, the investment environment is conducive enough that there's inflow of foreign investment, not just from China, but from other countries as well, because that, again, was one of the key objectives and the goals behind developing the CPEC, developing the Gwadar port, that it won't be just a one-off engagement with China, but would also serve as a point of attraction for various other countries and investors all over the world. So, but just one line to just to put forth, coming back to the Discord leaks, do you think it would change the nature or would slightly impact the nature of Pakistan-US relationship? Because while we've honed a lot on Pakistan's and China's strategic relationship, Pakistan and the US, they've had a complex but yet a very strategic relationship too, and it goes as back as the conception of Pakistan. During the 70s, Pakistan was the middleman between, the very first state visit that US president made to China. Pakistan was there. Then in the war against the Soviet during the 1980s, then in the war on terror more recently, when Pakistan was again an ally at the very forefront and kind of suffered a lot as well. But now with the Taliban back in Afghanistan, the US army is no longer there. The need for Pakistan has changed, the need that was there as little as 2-3 years ago. What are some of the ways where Pakistan and the US can collaborate strategically? And would this new information that's come to the horizon, would it impact those future prospects?
Yeah, well, I could respond to the what you just said first in terms of the impact of the Discord links on U.S.-Pakistan relations. I don't think that there would be much of an impact on the relationship. I think that the revelation is about what Khar had written will, I think, prompt Washington to redouble the efforts that it's already pursuing with Pakistan, and that really can, in my view, I mean, based on conversations I've had with U.S. officials, Washington's goal at this point is to ensure that it has enough of a relationship with Pakistan that Pakistan does not feel compelled to be wholly reliant on China. And so I'm sure that U.S. officials recognize that Pakistan has a very close relationship with China, and that's not going to end, and that's not going to stop. But I think that for U.S. officials, the challenge is how to convince Pakistan that it's worth continuing to cast their lot with the United States into the long term, even with the understanding that the China-Pakistan relationship is always going to be what it is. And so we've seen already conversations between the U.S. and Pakistan about what the relationship can and should look like post-Afghanistan withdrawal. We know that the relationship is not going to be anchored around Afghanistan-focused issues, or even counterterrorism or security issues more broadly. I think that from a Washington side, I think there's a very genuine desire to explore areas, ways to partner on things like clean energy, climate change mitigation, and trade more broadly, as well as health. There's a new bilateral health dialogue that was instituted a few months ago, soon after our new ambassador in Washington took office. But at the same time, I think that there's a recognition, a realization in Washington that it's going to be very difficult to make any forward movement on any of those issues until Pakistan's poly crisis is eased, particularly the economic aspects of it. It's very difficult for the U.S. to, scale up bilateral trade volume with Pakistan at a moment when, for instance, there's containers that are sitting at the side of Karachi port because the traders cannot get the letters of credit, can't deliver things. It's just not possible. But I do think that beyond that, the goal in Washington is to look at how to scale up trade and how to scale up areas of cooperation that would really harken back to the days of the strategic dialogue between the U.S. and Pakistan when relations were better. Now, I'm not saying that the two sides are going to bring back the strategic dialogue, but I think that there is a desire to look to some of those issues that had been the focus of that dialogue some years ago, and finally bring this back to U.S.-China competition. I think that one tool the U.S. would like to use to try to move the needle forward in its relationship with Pakistan, even against the backdrop of great power competition, is the Development Finance Corporation, which you would be well familiar with. It's a relatively new U.S. government agency linked to the Indo-Pacific strategy. And the DFC, it's meant to sponsor infrastructure projects that are clean, efficient, transparent, in opposition to China, of course, in opposition to Chinese investments. Use the DFC to explore the possibility of investments in clean energy infrastructure in Pakistan. Now, that's sort of tricky because I don't think the U.S. government views Pakistan as part of the Indo-Pacific and as part of the Indo-Pacific strategy. But keeping in mind what we've seen over the last year or so, when a very senior U.S. official at the State Department, Dilawar Syed, the top official at State focused on investment, he traveled to Pakistan for a week to explore trade and investment opportunities, and he brought one or two executives from the DFC with him. So this is the direction that I think the U.S. would like to explore going in with Pakistan. But again, this is not something that can be pursued substantively in the here and now just because of Pakistan's internal mess.
No, actually, you've brought to the forefront some very key areas, and I think it's an urgent imperative, and it's a call for the global need as well, because you need to pivot towards cleaner energy. And a lot of the CPEC projects, the energy projects in specific, were one that were driven by coal energy and the consumption and generation of coal to spur power activity in the country. And on the other hand, the provision of these development financial institutions, such as the one that the U.S. is setting up and focusing on gearing towards Indo-Pacific areas, I think it can also serve as a great opportunity because we're past the years of state-controlled economies. Now, a lot of these interactions, these transactions are carried between the private sector to the private sector. And that's what we saw in CPEC as well. So that's a great opportunity. But I think it does usher a new age, a new era, where Pakistan and the US can build those relationships on things which actually matter for the well-being of the residents and the population that tend to reside in these countries. And with Pakistan as the fifth most populous nation in the world, it also has a huge market potential. And economically, I don't think there's the point to compare Pakistan with India anymore because India is way ahead. But the sheer size of the population that these two countries have, you tend to see a lot of missed opportunities. Amazon is in India, Google's in India, Apple recently, Tim Cook was there for the launch of an Apple store, and Pakistan is missing out. In the past, obviously there were security concerns, Pakistan borders of Afghanistan, and there was a full-blown war that was happening at its border. But I think things can improve as long as Pakistan gets its economic position settled, and it's kind of in a fix at the moment. But if they're able to kind of navigate very strategically, appropriately in the next few years, I think things can definitely sound better. So
yeah, and absolutely. If I could just respond to that, I agree with you, but I think I don't want to overstate just how easy and manageable it would be for the U.S. to try to pursue that idea of bringing DFC in, investing in clean energy infrastructure. The U.S. is so far behind China when it comes to investments, infrastructure investments, not just in Pakistan but in so many parts of Asia. And I think that it's going to be even more difficult, even within that narrow realm of clean energy infrastructure investments, because, as you know, China, I guess a year or two ago, announced that it was no longer going to fund coal power projects abroad. So China's own goals now revolve around clean energy infrastructure investments abroad, including in Pakistan. So, China can checkmate the United States on what Washington may believe to be its comparative advantage in this regard. So it's going to be very difficult for the U.S. to push forward. It cannot hold a candle to what China has been able to do in terms of its footprint, the number of investments and projects that it has on the ground. Obviously, what Washington is banking on is the idea that it can do investment better, that it can produce the types of outcomes that, as you had noted before, China has struggled to produce in terms of actual positive benefits for local communities on the ground in Pakistan and so on. The U.S. wants to try to do that, whereas China has struggled to do that. But we'll see how successful the U.S. is in that regard.
Yeah, no, but you rightly mentioned, I mean, China is catching up, and I do want to share that they've really upped the bar in terms of green technologies. They're the world leaders in building battery manufacturing, lithium-ion batteries, which feed into electric vehicles, which by itself is being looked upon as a green technology, something for the future. And by 2030, they still are the world leader, and by 2030, they're all set to encompass and make kind of get in charge of even more greater market capitalization. So yeah, you're absolutely right. But we do want to, end this on a positive note, where there are positives to take out for both Pakistan and for the US, and be optimistic for the future. And we've long concentrated on, extremism, on terrorism, on the war on terror, but things like cleaner energy, things like the exchange of technology, getting together and contributing towards things such as climate reparation, climate change as such. I think it's high time that we make that pivot. And even US can play a huge role in making sure that the relationship between Pakistan and India is better defined. There's greater regional integration, because I think you need to move forward. We need to move past those hostile rivalries that have continued to perpetuate over the last many years.
Yeah, absolutely. And indeed, as you note, the fact that there was a new loss and damage fund that was an agreement to launch a loss and damage fund at the last UN climate conference is remarkable. And that suggests that maybe global norms are starting to evolve when it comes to how developed countries can partner with developing countries to bring to strengthen the capacity of developing countries to mitigate against climate change. And certainly there are some possible opportunities for the U.S. and Pakistan in that regard, though, of course, keeping in mind the political calendar in the United States, we have an election coming up in just over a year, and if the Republicans come back to power, retake the presidency, a Republican president may feel differently about this idea of really moving the needle forward on climate change and the role it could play in foreign policy. There may not be as much of an interest in positioning the U.S. to cooperate with climate vulnerable developing countries. I know you wanted to add on a positive note, but I think that caveat is important, that right now there's a window for the next year or so. The Biden administration is absolutely all in on this idea of working with as many countries as it can, including China, I should say, to figure out ways to collaborate on mitigation. And I got to say, if there could ever be a breakthrough between the US and China on some type of agreement to work together on climate mitigation, that would be a big game changer for the world and a nice, good news story that the world could definitely benefit from these days.
Well, I mean, fingers crossed on the results of the US election that is to follow the next year. I mean, there's this precedent of President Trump pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement. So we really do not want to go back to those days. But on that note, thank you so much, Michael. It was super insightful. Great to know what you think, the implications. It's a kind of relief that you feel, and that the implications won't be that harsh. And there are opportunities where Pakistan can align strategically, develop closer relationship with both China and the US, and kind of balance, these complex scenario at the global arena. So thank you so much for your time. It was lovely having you.
Thank you. It was a great conversation. We'll have to do it again one day.
Absolutely. Would love to have you again. Thank you.